Order, please. Begin the day routine presenting reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's 76 public libraries continue to offer something to just about every Nova Scotian, including lending books, videos, and music, and providing educational and personal interest programs for all ages. Whereas the importance of our public libraries to our economy was reinforced in a recent survey that indicated many Nova Scotians use public libraries to support their work or business. Whereas in the past year, national and international awards have been won by the Halifax, Pectuaniganish, and the Western County Regional Libraries. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in recognizing Public Libraries Week from October 20th to 26th, and thank the many staff, trustees, and volunteers at our regional library for their dedication and hard work. And, Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to make an introduction today in the gallery up here, Mr. Dan Yatmachuk in the East Gallery. Dan Yatmachuk from Sydney, who is a former alderman in the city of Sydney, a former steelworker activist, Local 1064, United Steelworkers of America, and the Cape Breton District Health Authority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Certainly welcome our special guest to the gallery today and hope he enjoys the proceedings. The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas Nova Scotia has achieved world fame as a leader in the conversion of waste into resources, and whereas this success involves partnerships with municipal governments and the active support of all citizens of Nova Scotia, and whereas communities, municipalities, businesses, and organizations across Canada have committed to working together to continue Nova Scotia's success in waste resource management, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join with all Nova Scotians to observe Waste Reduction Week today through October 26th and pledge to continue our efforts to maintain Nova Scotia's leadership position in resource recovery. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I present this notice on behalf of my colleague, the Honourable Minister of Health Promotion. I hereby give notice that at a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Pap Test Awareness Week begins on October 19th, and whereas there is a need for education and awareness around the importance of Pap test screening, since regular testing prevents approximately 95% of all cervical cancers, and whereas Cancer Care Nova Scotia has developed a teaching resource for Nova Scotia schools to increase young people's awareness of the importance of preventative screening. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize Pap Test Awareness Week and congratulate Cancer Care Nova Scotia and its partners for working with community groups and organizations to raise awareness about the health benefits of regular Pap test screening. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 19th to 25th marks Nova Scotia's second annual and still Canada's only Responsible Gaming Awareness Week, and where its objective is to increase awareness and to educate people about the importance of playing games of chance responsibly, and whereas this week is a partnership with the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation, the Office of Health Promotion, the Atlantic Lottery Corporation, and Casino Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that this government continue to strongly support the responsible gaming efforts of its gaming stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that in a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas older Nova Scotians will have access to lifelong learning programs and educational resources that better meet their specific needs and interests, thanks to a project initiated by a committee of the Senior Citizens Secretariat. And whereas the Seniors for Literacy Committee of the Secretariat released 2 publications today that will help community learning networks upgrade their basic skills, the basic skills of older Nova Scotians. And whereas the publications are entitled Enhancing the Basic Learning Skills of Older Nova Scotians, Context and Strategies, and Enhancing the Basic Learning Skills of Older Nova Scotians, a resource kit, and will be provided to community learning networks across the province. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate the Seniors for Literacy Committee of the Nova Scotia Seniors Secretariat on the release of their useful publications and thank them for their hard work on behalf of older Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers, it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October marks the observance of Women's History Month in Canada and October 18th marks Persons Day, the day in 1929 when Canadian women were recognized as persons under the law, and whereas many Nova Scotian and Canadian women over the years have worked long and hard to achieve rights such as right to vote, many rights we now take for granted, and whereas this year Women's History Month is on the theme, What Do You Mean Women Couldn't Vote? And to mark the month, the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women has published a fact sheet on women and elected office in Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize Women's History Month in Canada and the long line of Nova Scotia women who have fought for full equality at home, in the workplace, and in public life. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 168,000 Nova Scotians are members of the credit union system in the province, and whereas in 2002 the combined credit union assets in Nova Scotia grew 9.1% to $1.2 billion, an increase of more than $97 million, and returned more than $1 million to members in the form of common share dividends and rebates. And whereas Nova Scotia's 38 credit unions donated more than $350,000 to community development projects, charities, and scholarships across the province. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the efforts of the more than 800 Nova Scotians who manage and staff our credit union system and wish them continued success as they continue to invest profits into the communities of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that at a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas more than 400 foster families in Nova Scotia are being thanked this week for their dedication and commitment to children in need, as the province celebrates Foster Family Appreciation Week from October the 19th to the 24th, and whereas foster parents provide a nurturing environment for our children and youth and enables young people to have safe and loving homes in their times of need, and whereas foster families are the backbone of our child protection system, who work as a part of a professional team to ensure children and youth receive the encouragement and support they need to overcome challenges. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House commend the more than 700 Nova Scotian foster families who give so much of themselves so that children and young people can have a brighter future. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 396 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Remembrance Day Act.
Sure.
The Honourable Member for Richmond begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 396 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Remembrance Day Act.
Bill 22, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 396 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Remembrance Day Act.
Order this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 246, Revised Statutes 1989, the Labor Standards Codes, and Chapter 235 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Interpretation Act.
There.
The honourable member for Richmond begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labor Standards Code, and Chapter 235 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Interpretation Act.
Bill 23, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labor Standards Code, and Chapter 235 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Interpretation Act.
Order this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that at a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hard-working Nova Scotians in coastal communities, Mr. Speaker, whereas Peter McGinn of Prospect died tragically on Saturday, October 18th, while assisting with relief efforts in the aftermath of Hurricane Juan. Whereas Mr. McGinn served as the Secretary of the Prospect Area Full-Time Fishermen's Association, whereas Peter McGinn had worked tirelessly on behalf of local fishermen. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature extend its condolences to the McGinn family, friends, and the community on the tragic loss of Peter McGinn. I ask for a waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a national survey released last week concluded that Nova Scotians are turning to food banks for assistance more than ever before. And whereas Hunger Count 2003 showed Nova Scotia food bank lineups grew by 9.9% last year, an increase of 25.2% since 1997. And whereas hunger is a symptom of poverty, and according to the federal government's market basket measure, 16.1% of Nova Scotians live on low incomes. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the increasing problem of hunger amongst Nova Scotians and encourage government to take immediate action to reverse this growing trend. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Here no. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice at a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas, if Hurricane Juan didn't do enough devastation, Prospect Area fisheries personnel were dealt another blow of tragedy Saturday morning when Peter McGinn, a former DFO worker and secretary of the local Fisheries Association, suffered a heart attack. And whereas Peter was working at the government wharf in Upper Prospect, unloading gear donated by fishers from southwestern Nova Scotia to help Prospect and area fishers who lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in gear as a result of Juan. And whereas Peter was a friend, a neighbor, and somebody who people could look up to and count on, and his death is a loss for the whole community. Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs recognize the selfless effort put forth by Peter McGinn, recognize his tremendous contributions in the local community of Prospect, and offer his family and wife and family the deepest condolences of all members of this House of Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Stu Hart was recognized throughout the world as one of Canada's foremost wrestling icons, and as the patriarch of one of Canada's most talented and famous wrestling family dynasties, the Hart family. And whereas as one of the greatest wrestling promoters and businessmen in the country, Stu Hart was well respected as a generous, compassionate person who contributed much to the province of Alberta and to the entire country. And whereas on Thursday, October 16, Stu Hart, known as the Dean of North American Wrestling, died at Rocky View General Hospital in Calgary at age 88 with his family by his side. And therefore, be it resolved, this House pay tribute to Stu Hart and the legacy he left behind, and extend condolences to the entire Hart family on the passing of this great Canadian icon who will be long admired and remembered throughout the world. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 19th to 25th marks this year's Small Business Week in Canada, which began in British Columbia in 1979, and whereas activities held throughout the Small Business Week provide training and development opportunities for entrepreneurs and potential entrepreneurs, enabling them to meet other business people and share ideas, and whereas much of the growth of the Canadian economy is due to dynamic entrepreneurs and the business they create, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge this week as Small Business Week and the important contributions these businesses make to our local and national economies. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I read this resolution on behalf of the Honourable Rodney MacDonald, the member for Inverness.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cape Breton's Celtic Colours Music Festival has been a remarkable success since its inception in 1997, and this year has been no exception. And whereas since the festival opened with its gala concert at Centre 200 in Sydney, to its closing at the world's biggest square dance in Quebec, the festival has been 9 fun, very full days of music and dance. And whereas this year there have been a focus on youth at the festival, with students from Denmark and Scotland participating, along with many of our talented young local performers. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House join me and recognize all the organizers, volunteers, and musicians who have made this year's Celtic Colours such a phenomenal success, and extend our best wishes to all those involved in the festival as we look forward to next year. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this is the third year for Canada's Healthy Workplace Week from October 20th to 26th. Whereas the mission is to promote a comprehensive and integrated approach to workplaces' health in order to improve and sustain the health of Canadian organizations, their environments, and their employees. And whereas the current government's record on workplace safety and health is dismal. Therefore, be it resolved that the government use the opportunity of a Healthy Workplace Week to finally make healthy and safe workplaces a priority in Nova Scotia.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas both NDP and Conservative members of this House are clearly losing their grip on local issues and instead are attacking the next Prime Minister of Canada, Paul Martin, and whereas these attacks are a desperate attempt to divert attention away from the fact that both parties cannot provide solutions to the problems faced by Nova Scotia, especially the deficit, and whereas instead of attacking Mr. Martin with sniping resolutions, the NDP and the Nova Scotia Progressive Conservative Party, or whatever they want to be called these days, could learn a few things about balancing the books from someone who actually accomplished the feat. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House recognize Paul Martin's achievements as Finance Minister and prepare for the extraordinary achievements to come when Paul Martin becomes Prime Minister. I would ask for a waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver. Heard several noes. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. The honourable member. Order, please. The honourable member Kings North has the floor.
Whereas the Queen's Jubilee Medal is awarded to those Nova Scotians that have made significant contributions to our province, and whereas Jackie Stevens, the daughter of Milford and Joyce Stevens of Port Williams, was recognized for her work with sexual assault legal education and training, and whereas Ms. Stevens is currently a community education coordinator for the Avalon Sexual Assault Centre in Halifax, a centre that provides information and support for sexual assault victims. Therefore, be resolved that the members of this House recognize Jackie Stevens for her outstanding efforts in sexual assault education and congratulate her on her receipt of the Queen's Jubilee Medal. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Hurricane Juan left many people in the infield area of Hants East without batteries, lamp oil, and many other items and goods suddenly critical for day-to-day living without electricity. And whereas the Enfield Home Hardware Store's motto is "Help is always close to home," And whereas the morning after the storm, Infield Home Hardware opened its doors and conducted transactions by pen and paper, flashlight, and by any other low-tech system or apparatus that it took in order to service the immediate demand by its customers and neighbors for essential emergency supplies. Therefore, be resolved this House of Assembly congratulate Bob and Don Bona, owners of Enfield Home Hardware, and their staff for their unhesitating response to a public need in a time of emergency. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Catholic Women's League motto is "In service of God and country," and whereas on Saturday, October 18, 2003, the Catholic Women's League of Stella Maris Parish, Louisbourg, celebrated its 50th anniversary of Christian service since its founding meeting on December 20th, 1953. And whereas Bishop Raymond Leahy, along with Father Errol McDowell, Father Conrad Edwards, and Father Tom Lathagy, celebrated service for the past and present members of Stella Maris Parish, CWL, in appreciation for their continued hard work in support of church, community, and family values. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House recognize and extend appreciation to the Catholic Women's League, Stella Maris Council, Louisbourg, Nova Scotia. And I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services on introduction.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, good friends of this province, and have traveled here from Cape Breton, actually Cape Breton Nova. I'd like to acknowledge that Barb and John Shaw are in the gallery, and perhaps they would stand up and accept the warm welcome of the House.
Certainly welcome our special guests to the gallery today and hope they enjoy the proceedings. Welcome. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Atlantic Fabrics in Glasgow was once again home to the volunteers as they collaborated to make quilts for Tierman House, Share the Warmth program. And whereas Tierman House is run under the direction of Karen O'Hara and provides a safe place for women of Pictou County who are victims of abuse. And whereas some of the quilts made in the annual program are given to clients of Tierman House when they leave the facility, many of whom had arrived at the shelter with only the clothes on their backs. The remaining quilts stay at home. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize Karen O'Hara, Atlantic Fabrics, and the many volunteers who donate their time and expertise to creating a welcome environment for women who are victims of violence in Pictou County, and I seek waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax, Chebucto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This resolution is introduced on behalf of my colleague, the member for Halifax Needham. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas on Thursday the member for Kings North stated that there are 16 new long-term care beds opening in Berwick, and whereas his statement gave the incorrect impression that Valley residents can anticipate a long-awaited increase in nursing home beds. And whereas the reality is that the 16 beds opening at Grandview Manor are private pay, unsubsidized, assisted living beds and not nursing home beds at all. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Kings North spend less time in this legislature attempting to defend the indefensible and spend more time doing his research. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notice table. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 5 female leaders in business, health, arts, and education will be honored Wednesday at the 14th Annual Women of Excellence Awards Dinner in Halifax. And whereas proceeds from the gala at the World Trade and Convention Center will go to Phoenix youth programs. And whereas in each of the past 5 years, the Halifax Cornwallis Progress Club has given $35,000 to Phoenix and expect to match that again this year. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House commend this philanthropic effort, congratulate this year's award nominees, and celebrate the achievements of all women throughout Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Waverly Fall River Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October the 20th, 1803, the town clock in Citadel Hill ticked its first talk, and whereas Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, had the clock built with money raised by public donations, and whereas a program in celebration to commemorate the town's clock, 2 centuries of loyal timekeeping, was held today at Citadel Hills Information Centre. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the legislature recognize the historic importance of Halifax's town clock in the extraordinary way it has marked time for 2 centuries. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice without debate.
Request for waivers, is agreed? All those in favor say aye. Order, please. The clerks can't hear the resolutions as being read. You need it read again? The honourable member for Waverly Fall River Beaverbank on the resolution again, please. Ask all the members to keep the noise down, please. If you have to talk, to take the conversations outside. The honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October the 20th, 1803, the town clock on Citadel Hill ticked its first talk, and whereas Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, had the clock built with money raised by public donations, and whereas a program in celebration to commemorate the town clock's 2 centuries of loyal timekeeping was held today at Citadel Hills Information Centre. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the legislature recognize the historic importance of Halifax's town clock, the extraordinary way it has marked time for 2 centuries. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice without debate.
Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas James M. McConnell, President and CEO of Scotsman Cooperative Services Limited, has served there for almost 40 years, and whereas during that time the co-op has grown from a community-based cooperative to one of the larger businesses in Atlantic Canada today, and whereas a retirement reception and dinner will be held on November 21st to honor the almost 4 decades of service of Jim McConnell. Therefore, it be resolved that this Nova Scotia legislature congratulate James M. McConnell for his leadership and dedicated service to Scotsman Cooperative Services Limited and wish him all the best in the future. And Mr. Speaker, I'll ask for a waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this past weekend, Emile Deveau and Carl Leblanc of Clare organized a donation of over 800 lobster traps for those who had gear destroyed or damaged by Hurricane Juan, and whereas the used lobster traps were collected from fishermen in the communities of Weymouth and Comoville in Digby County and trucked to Upper Prospect and West Dover, and whereas the Federal Department of Fisheries and Ocean provided the transportation for all of the equipment donated to these fishermen, therefore it be resolved that all members of this House recognize the tremendous efforts of Emile Deveau and Carl Leblanc for organizing the donation of lobster traps and equipment to the fishermen of Upper Prospect and West Dover. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice, please.
Waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 36 students at Parkview Education Centre are enrolled in a program that is giving them practical training in skilled trades, and whereas the Skills Trade Exploration Program, otherwise known as STEP, is a 2-year program taught by Karen Brazil and Mike Johnson, and whereas Parkview Education Centre, the South Shore District School Board, the Lunenburg campus of the South Shore Community College, and the Apprenticeship Training Division of the Department of Education have partnered to create this beneficial program. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize Karen Brazil, Mike Johnson, and all those who are involved in STEP, and acknowledge the growing need for programs focused on the trades in our provincial schools. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hardworking Nova Scotians in coastal communities who lost their fishing livelihood due to Hurricane Juan are conscientiously completing the disaster financial assistance forms. Whereas these women and men are collecting the necessary documentation as quickly as possible for this assistance, whereas these residents need this help now, Therefore, be it resolved that the appropriate departments at the respective levels of government process applications from fishermen for disaster assistance immediately in order to assist these Nova Scotians who make their living from the sea.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a slowdown in our offshore industries is continuing as Kerr McGee is closing its Halifax office, relocating its manager to Houston, and laying off 2 employees. And where despite commitments to drill in deep water off Nova Scotia, Kerr McGee has yet to drill 1 exploratory well. And whereas every time the Premier or the Minister of Energy tout commitments of investment, it must be tempered with the reality that such commitments are not enforceable and that companies decide when and if they will actually invest. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier take a leadership role in the offshore and accept responsibility for his failure to do anything significant to help grow the industry since he was elected Premier in 1999. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Several noes. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cobequid Multi-Service Centre, a vital emergency and diagnostic community medical facility, held its 10th annual walkathon recently, and whereas 200 walkers raised $38,000 towards a new, larger centre, and whereas this is $8,000 more than raised in the walkathon last year, therefore be it resolved that members of this House send a hearty congratulations to Walkathon Coordinator Bill McNeil, the walkers, and the other volunteers, staff at the Cobequid Community Health Centre. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Hurricane Juan knocked out power to many parts of Hants East, and where scores of people were caught without adequate gasoline supplies for generators, power saws, and vehicles. And whereas the morning after the storm, Don McNeil Shell in Elmsdale, with the help of a generator and good old-fashioned low-tech pumps, was able to provide fuel for dozens of gas-hungry residents. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Mr. Don McNeil and his staff for their speedy response to a need deepened by the emergency. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 19th to the 25th is Pap Test Awareness Week in Nova Scotia, and whereas a recent report prepared by Cancer Care Nova Scotia states that Nova Scotia still has the highest rate of cervical cancer in Canada, and whereas the number of women getting annual Pap tests falls below the 85% target set by the Nova Scotia Gynecological Cancer Screening Program. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the legislature extend our appreciation to Dr. Robert Grimshaw, Medical Director of the Nova Scotia Cancer Screening Program, family doctors, and other healthcare providers who continue to provide leadership in their roles by stressing the importance of prevention and early detection in the treatment of cervical cancer. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1803, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, ordered a clock to be sent to Halifax to keep the soldiers in their barricades on time. And whereas the clock has become known as Halifax town clock and a distinct symbol of our province's capital city. And whereas today marks the 200th anniversary of the town clock as Halifax's official timekeeper. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House congratulate this unique icon and wish for 200 more years of its service to the people of Halifax and all Nova Scotia, and ask for waiver.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the U.S.-based magazine The Scientist surveyed 2,210 researchers throughout the world at 168 institutions to assess what university had the best working environment, and whereas in analyzing the results, the scientists ranked Dalhousie University as the best university outside the United States at which to work as a researcher compared with 37 other non-American facilities, and whereas since its founding in 1818, Dalhousie University has never lost sight of fostering local pride and a sense of community while building an international reputation for its excellent research. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Dalhousie University and its excellent research staff on receiving this recognition that has made Dalhousie University not only a superior place to work, but an institution for which Nova Scotians can be proud. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
For waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since 1981, 11 counties saw their populations decline by approximately 37,000 people. And whereas 26,000 were lost on Cape Breton Island alone. And whereas depopulation in these counties and stagnant population growth in many others is one of the greatest impediments to prosperity, therefore be it resolved that all parties recognize depopulation as the greatest economic challenge in the regions, and that the government take a lead role to help find solutions to this neglected problem.
Notice table. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the fishing community and the people of Upper Prospect lost a dear and close friend over the weekend, and whereas Peter McGinn, a former DFO worker and secretary of the local Fishermen's Association, suddenly passed away over the weekend, and whereas I extend my deepest sympathies to Mr. McGinn's family and friends. So therefore be it resolved that all members of this House send their thoughts and prayers to Peter McGinn's family and friends on the loss of their dearly departed loved one. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
For waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minister responsible for Treasury and Policy Board refuses to table documents regarding the financial state of the province, even though that information should be public knowledge, and whereas the Minister has become the defender of the Code of Silence by refusing to release a policy paper that would give Nova Scotians a better understanding of the fiscal imperatives of this government, and whereas the Minister neatly bookends a Finance Minister who refuses to reveal the true nature of the current deficit. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister for Treasury and Policy Board break the code of silence gripping this government and recognize that he can reveal the truth today and address our province's financial problem, or wait until next spring and face an angry electorate.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 19th to the 25th marks National Foster Family Week, which honors the commitment and generosity of foster families. And whereas foster families are exceptional people who open their homes and hearts to children who are unable to live with their birth families. And whereas all Nova Scotians owe a debt of gratitude to our foster families who provide a healthy and secure environment for our children and youth. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank our foster families during this year's National Foster Family Week. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas it has become more apparent that the government is running a deficit of at least $54 million, and whereas the Minister of Finance refuses to answer questions regarding the $54 million deficit in this House, and whereas the Minister also refuses to tell Nova Scotians how he plans to balance the budget even though the fiscal year is half over. Therefore, be it resolved that the Finance Minister table in this House his specific plan to deal with the growing deficit. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? Here, no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Remembrance Day Act was established to ensure Nova Scotians continue to pay tribute to those who sacrificed their lives and health on our behalf and for those of future generations. And whereas Nova Scotians have been strong and loyal in their support of Canada's veterans and in observing Remembrance Day, the day set aside to honour the bravery and valour of those who fought and died to preserve our rights and freedoms in World War I, World War II, the Korean conflict, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and in international peacekeeping activities. And whereas under the provisions in the Remembrance Day Act and the Nova Scotia Labour Standards Code, this special day does not have the distinction of a statutory general holiday. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House call upon the government to declare November the 11th, Remembrance Day, a statutory holiday for all Nova Scotians. No again.
Order, please. Was a request for order? Or, sorry, order. Was a request for waiver? Did you laugh? No. Notice table. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas from 1996 to 2001, Nova Scotia saw a net out-migration of over 5,000 young people between the ages of 15 and 29, and whereas the declining youth population will have an impact on both our education system, and whereas the decline in the number of young people is a great impediment to economic growth, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize that the decline in our youth population is an issue that can no longer be ignored, especially concerning the impact on our education system. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice for passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas John Morgan, the Mayor of Cape Breton Regional Municipality, was named President of the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities held last week in Yarmouth, and whereas Mr. Morgan will hold the position for the next year replacing outgoing President Don Zwicker of Lunenburg County, and whereas this was the 98th Annual General Conference of the UNSM, bringing together hundreds of representatives from the province's 55 municipalities, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate CBRM's Mayor John Morgan on being named President of the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since 1996, 13 of Nova Scotia's 18 counties saw their population drop, and whereas Digby County lost 5% of their population, while Annapolis County dropped by 2.5%. Whereas rural depopulation is one of the greatest impediments of rural economic growth, therefore be it resolved that this government immediately take action to address the issue of rural depopulation before economic conditions further decline in rural Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? Here or no? Notice is tabled. Order, please. Any further resolutions? Orders today, government business, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 20, the Workers' Compensation Act / Occupation Health and Safety Act?
Bill number 20, the Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak on Bill 20, Amendments to the Workers' Compensation Act. Since the release in April 2002 of the Dorsey Report on workers' compensation in Nova Scotia, this government has been working closely with all parties involved to implement improvements to our workplace safety and insurance system that are fair and viable. The Workers' Compensation Board released a strategic plan that addresses several of the important issues affecting the system and focuses on 4 key goals: preventing workplace injuries and illnesses, improving benefits, enhanced stakeholder consultation, and enhanced accountability and performance measures. Today's bill will enable the Workers' Compensation Board to proceed with the improvements to the system over the next 4 years. This bill introduces improvements that will lessen the effects of inflation for persons receiving pensions by increasing the indexing of these pensions. Our goal is to move indexing from 50% of the Consumer Price Index to 55% this year. We are cutting red tape and improving the ability of the Workers' Compensation Board to respond to the needs of their clients by ensuring that the indexing of these pensions in the future can be completed by regulation. In addition to addressing the recommendations in the strategic plan, this legislation addresses the recent decision made by the Supreme Court of Canada on chronic pain. Through this bill, we will ensure that all injured workers, regardless of the injury they suffer, will be treated the same. We will repeal the sections of the Act specific to chronic pain and will work with all parties to develop regulations during the law amendments process. These regulations will enable the creation of a process that will support workers with chronic pain. The legislation will ensure quick resolution of some issues for injured workers by allowing the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal to correct obvious errors of natural justice and other areas without reopening an entire appeal. And finally, this legislation improves accountability. Through this bill, each of the agencies within Nova Scotia's workers' compensation system will be required to publicly report how they are doing in complying with statutory requirements each year. Today's bill builds on the many positive improvements made to the system over the past year. We moved the department's education and prevention units from the Occupational Health and Safety Division to the Workers' Compensation Board to make the board accountable for safety education and prevention initiatives. In 2002, we increased supplementary benefits by over $2,000 per year, moving to 1/2 of the average industrial wage for Nova Scotia. And we introduced legislation to allow paid and volunteer firefighters who contract specific cancers on the job access to benefits through the Workers' Compensation Board. Today, we're pleased to be implementing additional recommendations from the Dorsey Report that will strengthen our workplace compensation system for the benefit of injured workers. The health and safety of workers in Nova Scotia is a top priority of mine and is a top priority of this government. As the Dorsey Report pointed out, Nova Scotia continues to have the second highest assessment and the second lowest level of benefits. The issues with the workers' compensation system in Nova Scotia did not develop overnight, and they won't be corrected overnight. Injured workers in this province have been patient since the release of the Dorsey Report. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Injured Workers Associations for their participation in the strategic planning process and for helping the board to work towards implementing the recommendations from the Dorsey Report. I'm announcing today a continuation of the funding for the 4 groups that have participated in this process and have continued to bring issues forward on behalf of their members. Their continued participation is key to ensuring accountability and measuring progress towards the goals set out in the plan. And I've been very pleased with the level of participation by all stakeholders, including employers and labor groups in the planning process. The strategic plan marks a step in the right direction. Having a health and safety background, I appreciate the system's increased emphasis on accident prevention and accountability. I'm confident that our workplace safety and insurance system is moving in the right direction. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill 20 today. Thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Minister for bringing this bill forward, but much of my time today is going to be spent, Mr. Speaker, regarding of what's not in the bill. That, you know, and I heard him say that he thanked the injured workers and their families for being patient. And I'm going to tell the Minister that I believe that I think their patience is wearing thin. you know, we've had a year and a half now of Dorsey being presented, a year of Dorsey previous to that to being compiled by a stakeholder group that traveled throughout this province. And one could say that the government taking this slow, snail's pace approach to revamping of WCB would be wise in some ways if the only piece of information they had gleaned from the public was Dorsey. And had they gone and said, okay, we're going to take Dorsey and study it and so on. But, Mr. Speaker, there's been previous reports to Dorsey. We've had, you know, legislative committees look into WCB and so on. So one has to think of why do we, now that we have Dorsey on the books for over a year and a half, why are we now at this point, this juncture, if you will, why does this need further study? And why is it bringing in so gradually, if at all? Because we're being told that this is a phased process, but nobody is allowing or telling any of the parties, whether it's the small p political parties or the real stakeholders involved, what timeline we're looking at for a complete acceptance of the Dorsey report as it relates to changes in WCB. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've been fortunate in my tenure in this House to be the critic for WCB on numerous occasions, and have met some extremely fine people through the course of that critic area. And, you know, they're the ones that have taken me to school, quite literally, on the problems within the workers' compensation system in this province, Mr. Speaker. This is, you know, roughly we're talking about a system that came into effect pre-1920, probably around 1917, in this province to recognize an inequality in the workplace, and that was worker injury. Now, what was set up at that time was a no-fault insurance system, and that seems to be quite topical today in the automobile realm. But this was a no-fault workplace insurance system that was accepted by and large on the premise that the employer would pay the premiums, and for that aspect that the worker would lose the right to litigate. And so, you know, it's a system on that side has worked fairly well, that, you know, insurers have, being the employers, have been, I would consider, by and large, practiced due diligence. Now, we can cite, and maybe I will, as I get on to this, Mr. Speaker, areas of employers that I believe didn't practice due diligence around workplace injury, but by and large, you know, it's the idea that I don't think all Nova Scotian businesses should be tarred with the brush of being irresponsible, because I think most employers are good employers when it comes to worker safety, because of the reality of that if you do not look after your workers in a safe and reasonable manner, that obviously you're not going to get anybody to work for you. It's as simple as that. So we have, you know, the early, basically the first quarter of the previous century of evolving a workplace insurance system to help workers and to make sure that if they were to be injured on the workplace, or if a fatality had been incurred, that there was a form of insurance for the family because of the fatality, or that the worker would be duly compensated if it was a workplace injury, and that they would be allowed to have a reasonable amount of income, if you will, Mr. Speaker. So we've seen that. We've seen part of the studies back, and we'll move ahead to the 60s and 70s, Mr. Speaker. And one of the big problems that workers had identified around WCB was at that point was the CRS or the clinical rating system, which to many people refer as the meat chart. Now, the meat chart was quite simply similar to that what you would have saw in old butcher shops, really, and that's why it came there. They would show you the various cuts, and so what happened with the meat chart, that certain injuries would be compensated at a certain rate. Now, you know, back on February 96, when the new version of workers' comp came into effect, which we evolved into a wage loss system, which I'll refer to for today as the Abbas bill, that it went into the idea of the percentage of your impairment related to the amount of the ability to earn a wage at a certain rate, and therefore they would use a mathematical equation to determine that, and that's what your wage would be. So as opposed to saying you get $100 a month if you lose one of your digits, it would be directly related to your income and how it affected your income. So we went into a wage loss system, which really was one of the major, in the latter half of the last century, really became one of the major changes, because what we really then end up seeing was a real kind of line drawn that people had seen that we are either on the old CRS system or we're now on this new wage loss system. And indeed, there's an argument, and I'll get into it later, about did the board purposely hold back decisions that they have thought they would have lost under the clinical rating system and waited to bring them forward when the legislation changed, and indeed the legislation allowed them to claw back and go in and get these. One of these I'll talk about later is primarily people as it related to automatic assumption and minors' lung disease. That was one of the ones that has been a major problem, and to my estimation, the board has never really fully reconciled and helped the workers. So we had the problems when we went to the clinical rating system, which that bill became effective, as it says, Feb. 1, 96. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time in intervening history between 1970 and 1996, Mr. Speaker, for no other reason than you may rule me out of order. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it was an interesting time after that when we had basically the two systems, and they were working at some parallel in this province. And so when it came into effect, we've had some serious problems. We had Dowart was on the go then, which was a case around chronic pain, and the ability does the province through its workers' compensation board recognize chronic pain. So we had that out there. And when many of us, including yourself, Mr. Speaker, came into the legislature in 98, there was a considerable amount of flux going on within the workers' compensation system, to the point that injured workers were occupying government offices. And to that point, I would say it was one of the greatest stimuluses to have an all-party committee at that time, again, one of the many, to study the workers' compensation system in Nova Scotia. Now, Mr. Speaker, what we found out through those meetings and through those hearings, which I was a member, Mr. Speaker, as the now Justice Minister was chair of those meetings, Mr. Speaker. So we had the reality of then that committee made up of equal members, because again, it was done in a time of minority government. It was done in a time of uncertainty because the newness of the Feb. 1, 96 effective legislation. So there was much kind of trying to find our own way, trying go over ground that had just been gone over, not 5, 6 years. And with insight was knowing that there was going to be a mandated through the Feb 196 legislation, the Abbott's bill, that there would be a mandated review by a stakeholders committee. So we knew in light of what we were doing. So what was essentially going to happen was a microscopic look at WCB over a period I would say 3 times in less than a decade. Now, when our committee toured the province, we heard, to say the least, many horror stories about workplace injury, and it ranged from everything from industrial diseases to chronic pain to widows' pensions, and indeed supplementary benefits for pensions. All of these were put on the table and many more were put on the table as we traveled throughout Nova Scotia. Now, as we got together, and as groups like ourselves would do, we tried to formulate and put together what we thought was the meat of what we heard while going across the province. But one of the biggest things we heard was, look, every time that WCB is looked at with, a long view, if you will, what suffers is workers' benefits. Now, the idea that workers' benefits are structured downward just about every time we look at what's going on with WCB. So now we have to look at and say, okay, are we doing a step forward with Bill 20? Is Bill 20 the substantive piece of legislation that injured workers and employers need in this province? And it's interesting because you got to look at Bill 20 really in 2 different lights. One, as it relates to the broader question of Dorsey, and the other, the more streamlined idea of what it does with chronic pain. Now, what it does for chronic pain, and I think we've got to understand that out of the All-Party Committee in 98, 99 came Bill 90, but some legislation was hived off that report and brought forward, and some of it was the basis for the treatment of chronic pain. That's been subsequently overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada in a 9-0 vote. And basically what the court has said, it's discriminatory. You cannot discriminate on those bases. So we're here today and we're asking this legislation to repeal those sections that apply to chronic pain so as we can look to another group to come forward with its version of how do we make chronic pain, A, compensable, and B, how do we therefore pay for it. So these are 2 very heavy, weighty issues. But what we don't have in this bill is how that is going to be structured. And I want to tell the government that is very important, because no matter if it's accurate or if it's inaccurate, there certainly appears within injured workers in this province that they do not have the full confidence, or they do not give their confidence to WCB and its management team. There's what they refer to me as, on quite a few times, as an institutional bias against them. So what we have to do, first of all, if we're looking at deleting the notion of chronic pain, which we have to, and again, part of the 9-0 decision clearly stated that this had to be 6 months, no more than 6 months hence. So we have to, we have to do this in a timely fashion. What groups have been telling me since this decision, and indeed, more importantly, since the bill has been tabled, is that there's a fear in this circle that their concerns will not be listened to and heeded. Now, they'll tell you, and rightfully so, that they have the ear, quite often, of the people down at the board level, but are they really listening? And that's a problem. They're saying, we can say what we want. It's like the focus groups and so on. It's that this is coming forward purporting to be, as the stuff that relates to Dorsey, as being related and endorsed by labor and by the injured workers. Now, that's not what's coming back to me, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, when I talk to these groups, they're saying that that's quite the opposite, that it's a mandate, they tell me, from board management that says, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to move forward this way. And a lot of the Dorsey recommendations are not really reflective of the front end of Dorsey that they would want to see. So that caused a problem. And I want to stay on the fact of chronic pain before I get too far into what's not here from Dorsey. But the fact is that if you have that kind of institutional bias or feeling that there's that institutional bias at the board level, they're not going to buy in to being felt as being equal partners at the table when trying to come up with a piece of regulation, a piece of legislation that could be crafted that would show that everybody is on the same page when it comes to chronic pain. They believe that this will be driven more by financial considerations at the board than injured worker considerations at the board. They believe that a large portion of this will be hinged on the unfunded liability as opposed to what's best for injured workers, because injured workers will tell you that, it wasn't an injured worker that caused the unfunded liability at WCB. It was mismanagement. So what are they saying is that fair for me to be caught as the party that helps pay down the unfunded liability at a quicker rate than it was assessed by either Dorsey or other groups to fit the timelines of somebody at the board, rather than the real concerns of injured workers throughout this province, and especially injured workers as it relates to chronic pain. So this is what we have to be asking our legislators, is what are we going to do? Are we going to merely say that this is going to be handed off to quote-unquote stakeholders to look after, and with no real teeth, with the idea that their concerns are not going to be listened to? So, Minister, through you, Speaker, to the Minister, that's one thing I think he, and I believe he understands this, that there are problems, or at least perceived problems, between the board and injured workers and other groups out there.
Order, please. Would the honourable member allow for an introduction? Sure. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries on an introduction of his younger sibling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just like to stand and introduce my brother who's in the East Gallery, Kevin D'Entremont. Thank you for coming to the House, and I was wondering if we could just welcome him to the House of Assembly today.
Certainly welcome our guest to Gallery today and hope he enjoys the proceedings. Thank you to the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre. Now has the floor.
Speaker. Well, at least there's one good-looking one in the family. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, saying that, that there has to be a real buy-in. I don't think you can adequately say that injured workers and labor will buy into another committee to look at how chronic pain is going to affect them. If they find right now that the strategic planning groups don't seem to be listened to, or their sides of those groups don't seem to be listened to now around Dorsey. So I think that's something I would like to see the minister really look at and say, how can we give this group the teeth, but more importantly, probably the transparency, so everyone can see that the resolution around chronic pain is going to be one that everyone will have an honest-to-goodness stake in, that they will not, that other concerns will not be brushed aside, that the weights of consideration around unfunded liability takes precedent over the idea that workers are injured and should be paid a reasonable compensation for those injuries. I believe that's what has to be the tenet of any agreement, not what our unfunded liability is. Again, I say that because, Speaker, that it's not, I can't say it loud enough or long enough, that the unfunded liability at WCB did not happen because workers went out and got injured. It was done through, I say without fear of hesitation, that it was bad management. It was management of and again, I've got to, before I get too far down that road, it's gone a long way to get rid of that management style where it was an area of great patronage appointments and appointments that really didn't reflect the people who it was going to serve. It became more of a political, a master to political servants than really the people it was meant to serve, and that were the injured women and men of this province. But with that said, Mr. Speaker, I've got to say again that board and the management down there have moved light years from where we were in the just a short decade ago for responsibility. Well, Mr. Speaker, the education minister says good government in the last 4 years, and that may be his opinion. It's certainly not mine. We've had a government. We had a government that largely ignored WCB. If it was a good government, we would have Dorsey in place today. We wouldn't be talking around the edges. We wouldn't be saying these things, Mr. Speaker. We would be here, and we would be implementing Dorsey, and we would be moving forward with much fanfare and helping the injured workers of Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, let's move on to a bit about the Dorsey report and why I believe the importance of it, because I think Dorsey report, like no other report that my short tenure in this House, has really the one completely honest, unfettered document. It's been unsullied by political hands. It was a group of Mr. Dorsey himself James Dorsey is a recognized expert and around compensation matters. Was a former chair in British Columbia, and his committee were stakeholders from labor, injured workers, and medical and business sectors from across the province, Mr. Speaker. It was not one that was driven by, like I stated earlier, in 1998, a bunch of politicians going around and looking to kind of position themselves around the WCB issue. These were people that were, again, that were Nova Scotians, with the exception of the chair who was brought in to, again, I got to say that it was a universally accepted chair. He was not from this province, so it gave him a bit of distance to look at the problems that existed in WCB. So what we did, we had this group go across the province and ask for submissions and receive these submissions from ordinary working people across the province. Labor groups were involved, injured workers would give reports, business groups gave their position, and indeed some politicians gave their position. when the Dorsey Commission came to town. So what we did, they go away, and in this whole process, and I'm talking round numbers, is about a year between when it hits the road to the final report they bring to the House in April 2002. And so far, what we have seen out of Dorsey in a year and a half is the only piece of legislation out of Dorsey that has come to this House by way of Dorsey was the around pension benefits, Mr. Speaker. That was the only piece we had seen come forward. Nothing else has been brought forward. We have, I would put forward today, Mr. Speaker, that we ended up with the supplemental benefits question put on the table and move forward through the persistence of the injured workers groups throughout this problem and identifying this as a correctable issue that could be done with very little expense to the board, and it was their pressure on government that saw that change come forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I say, it was just one of the many recommendations of Dorsey, but it was one that I thought affected a lot of people and affected them in a very positive way. We've seen people's, like going from an existence of as one gentleman in my constituency, he was basically using the Visa to pay the MasterCard, to pay the other credit card down because it was because he was an injured worker, and because he found himself in a situation as it related to Canada Pension that he just did not, there was no top-up provision there for him, and he was I think at that time, his income was less than $10,000 a year. And this is a gentleman that had worked in construction, worked as a drywaller, and certainly one that in an industry that is or in one of the trades that's fairly busy 12 months of the year because the vast majority of their work is indoors and is not inhibited by weather as some of the others may be, like sheet metal and roofing and so on, where weather is a greater determinant of how much work you get and so on. So, Mr. Speaker, here was a guy that was affected greatly by supplemental benefits. So, through the persistence of these injured workers groups, this was brought forward. So this was brought forward and it was passed. So that's the only thing right now that we have from Dorsey. Now, let's look at some of the other recommendations of Dorsey, and I think that some of the ones that are not in this bill in particular, that we don't understand why they wouldn't be included. One, and it was the original Bill 90, and it's not in this one, or was at least discussed around Bill 90, is universality. Now, you can look at universality in two different ways, and one is employers can look at it and say, look, you're bringing us in as a cash cow. You want us in here just to help pay down the unfunded liability. We have no right being in WCB. You just want our money. And quite honestly, Mr. Speaker, I see it as a wrong way to go about it, especially now when we're looking at WCB as a source for much of the workplace safety. And my argument to them today about universality is if you do not come in and pay your premiums, you'll still be able to access all those health and safety programs and so on from WCB, but you're not on the hook one dime for it, not one dime. So if that's going to come out of the accident fund or wherever, if we're going to take this money from premiums coming in today and be solely responsible for workplace prevention and safety, then I think it's incumbent that all workplaces now become involved with paying benefits. I think premiums, excuse me, Mr. Speaker. I think it's almost a no-brainer. Yet we don't really see that. I'm sure that there's at some point a phased-in issue about bringing in uninsured companies and employers. And I somewhat agree with that. That I don't think you should work. Should be like tomorrow, everybody's in. I think there's a right way to do it, and a phased-in approach would be appropriate. That these people could, first of all, be allowed a time period to get their books into adjustment to it. I don't think, I appreciate how workers and employers are saddled with a cumbersome payroll system as it is now, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to payroll taxes. And so we should be allowing them to get ready for this coming expense. But on the other side of it, I know it will be perceived as the first go around as an expense, but I would contend, Mr. Speaker, that if we're going to do workplaces, as Bill 20 says, make WCB responsible for workplace safety and accident prevention, then I think that says to every employer in this province that every employer now has a stake in this, and part of your stake, obviously, is going to be that you have to pay premiums into WCB. It's not one about a tax grab or anything like that, or benefits grab, or premiums grab. It's none of those things. It's just the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker. Another issue many injured workers talk about, and that is medical evidence, Mr. Speaker. If I was to say the one thing that the majority of injured workers can least understand about the WCB system in this province is, why do I have a report here from my specialist, who's a specialist, whether it's a neurologist, whether it's an orthopedic surgeon, whether it's an internist, I have it here. But over here, the board has a member of the medical society, but just if you will, just an MD, and whose assumption around the case overrules a specialist. Mr. Speaker, I guess look at in the terms like this, it's much like chronic pain, where one body said chronic pain was okay, a lower court, but it went to a higher court where more learned people were, if you will, and said, no, it's wrong. And we, as Canadians, accept that as the higher court's decision. So one has to wonder, if you look at the medical profession being that, if board doctors can routinely overrule specialists who have, by virtue, a specialty in that area, what's the purpose? Why are we wasting workers' times to go see a neurologist or an internist or an orthopedic specialist if the board is going to take their doctors and do this? I'll relate to you back in 1998 when we were on the all-party committee, and in this very room we had representatives of WCB, and I forget which one of the doctors it was from WCB was asked a question around, so-and-so went into this doctor's office. He was a board doctor. He went into his office and he had a shoulder injury. The claimant walked into the doctor's office. The doctor asked him to walk towards the desk, turn around, and sit down. And so he did as asked by the physician. And then the doctor asked him a few, kind of routine-style questions, his name and so on. So then he said, "Thank you very much. I'll do my report." And the injured worker was bewildered by this. And so passed the story along to one of the members of the committee at that time, and related this story to the board doctor that was here that day in this very room. And the answer was shocking, to say the least, that the board doctor had said, "Oh no, our doctors are so well trained that they can just, what we're looking at is not the bigger picture of this, it's just the minute size of that injury." And he could tell by him walking across the room and how he carried himself if his shoulder was damaged. And I'm thinking, we don't need MRIs. We don't even need kryptonite in this province. We got these guys to say that about somebody. You know, Mr. Speaker, he wants to know, ask Superman. The Minister of Education wants to know what you do with kryptonite, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, here it is. These are the type of problems, and I just put forward one there of why, why do we allow this to happen time in and time out? Why is that not dealt with in this bill to come up with a system that would allow a balance there? I don't think, injured workers or anybody could say, look, we want the system weighted towards us. But right now, it's weighted in the side of the WCB. And what they're asking for is bring it to the middle, is allow something to come up and say, we'll give someone who's neutral in this to allow us a real third-party decision. And this is what we don't see. Some could say that's WCAT's role. It isn't. WCAT doesn't take, I think, the leadership role it should around that. Maybe after the federal court decision, it may look at it differently. But I would think that we could save ourselves a lot of time and expense if there was some sort of mediation rather than one of these two, being the side. Again, I think it all has to go to fairness. You cannot have anything work if it's going to be weighted on one side or the other. So, Speaker, that's another thing through you. I would hope that the minister hears and we'll look at that. We need to see fairness around the medical diagnostic version of what goes on. Now, another problem that has always plagued WCB, and this is part of WCB and the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, is the fact of deeming. Now, Mr. Speaker, for the uninitiated, deeming is something that's what they do is if you have a certain amount of injury, but you're not fully disabled, they will say we can deem you to work 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week. Maybe if you're a laborer, a more relaxing or easy type job, they may say you may be able to drive a cab, or you may be able to work at a computer terminal for fewer hours and so on. But there's a whole lack in the deeming process, and the board will say this but never really acknowledge it, that there's always a great miscarriage of justice around the deeming factor, because what happens is a couple of things. Is that when deeming is put into effect around injured workers, what is never really ever considered is what the employment factors are in the area. Now, the board has told us time, oh yes, we do. And if there's one issue that I've fought tenaciously with the board about, and at WCAT hearings, is the reality of deeming and how it's affected. One thing would be, as the minister said in his preamble about doing housekeeping duties, if you will, around WCAT. One of them would be when WCAT gives a decision and says that the Workers' Compensation Board has deemed this person inappropriately, that they then give parameters of where they can do this deeming at. Because what happens is, I've seen it on numerous occasions when it comes back at the board level for reconsideration, somebody at the board level will then say, well, okay, we deemed you to be able to be a night watch person or a security guard. Well, okay, that was found to be faulty. Now we'll deem you to be a cab driver. Well, we find, so we send it back and say, look, that's not reasonable. The person lives in a rural part of the province where there's really no cabs. So we come back and we do it again. I think what would be more appropriate would be had WCAT would say within their decision, these are areas which we deem the worker eligible to work in, and look at it not only from a perspective of the workplace injury, but the reality of the economy of the area. That, you know, again, people could say, oh, look, that person can go and they can get a job. You know, there's lots of cab jobs in Halifax. Is that fair because you've gotten injured in the workplace? And you've been third or fourth generation woods worker from one of the rural counties in this province, that you have to uproot your family and move to Halifax just to live up to a litmus test of the WCB? And I say, you know, as a matter of fact, I heard a few resolutions today about out-migration. And I don't think anybody really wants to look at affecting our rural areas any more than what they are. And I think that would be a way to help protect our injured workers so that, you know, that the board doesn't unreasonably come back. And, you know, I know just in where I come from, in my riding, Mr. Speaker, I know one individual it was 3 attempts to find out, to deem them into a position. And it was really unfair for them. And at the end of it, the worker capitulated and said, look, I'll take it. If you want to deem me and say I can make, you know, that job I can make $80 a week at, then fine. I'm just tired of fighting you. And that's another area we come into. And what comes across my table many, many times is the board's aggressiveness around injured workers. Now, you know, I've talked to many people at the board, and they said, you know, we realize that, you know, what we try to do is get the injured worker their benefits as quick as we can and make things right again, and with all avenues looked at getting them back to being a full participant in the workforce. And by itself, that's a very laudable statement, Mr. Speaker. But that more and more people you talk to, that's not the case. It's not one where I've had a great deal of occasion with it. That it's more, and you know, the ones you hear about are ones that have been like kind of marginalized by WCB and have been told, well, no, this is you know, this is your benefits, they've run out, and you've got to go back to work without any real whether it's any real kind of whether it's physiotherapy or vocational rehab. Those things aren't offered in an open way that people can understand. I talked to one gentleman this week, and he's been offered vocational rehab by WCB, but he's afraid to accept it because he doesn't kind of know what's behind the door number 2, if you will, to use that game show expression, Mr. Speaker. So we don't know that, you know, what's really out there for these workers, these injured workers. And with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, comes another minefield for this bill. And what it is we'll do it by the way of regs. We'll do it in the regulations. Now, that's always the scary one, because what we had here in chronic pain, we had a piece, albeit faulty, a piece of legislation that we could take to a court and eventually have it overturned because it was faulty and it discriminated against a certain section of workers, Mr. Speaker. Not so easily done by way of regulations, and not so easily done for open and transparency, as it should be open and debated in this House. And it's, you know, again, I am not in no way, shape, or form, Mr. Speaker, casting aspersions on especially the minister and his government that they're trying to do anything nefarious here. That I think what they're trying to do is trying to come up with a solution of some of the problems at the Workers' Compensation Board. But I would say to the minister that's an avenue. If you go by the route of regulation, it's one that's fraught with danger, Mr. Speaker, because it's opened not so much to today's government maybe, but governments down the road, that it's a much easier way to get at and maybe deny access in certain ways, through orders in council and so on. So it's not done what I think the intention of the Supreme Court decision is not so much to start doing stuff in a more, by way of behind the closed doors of cabinet. Indeed, I think what the instructions from the October 3rd decision of the Supreme Court of Canada is one of saying this should be open because we need transparency here. You've proven that you'll discriminate here with full public debate on a bill. What will happen by way of regulations that are done in the infamous bunker, if you will, Mr. Speaker? So these are problems that we have to go and say, why would government want to do these major changes by way of regulation and not by way of amendments in legislation? And I would hope that at some point the minister will fill that out for us more, Mr. Speaker, because I would say that this bill will have a hard time passing the hurdles over law amendments if it doesn't substantially change that position. And what we're looking for here, and I've got, the minister, I know I don't have to remind the minister that this is a bill that's affected by a timeline. Many bills that come before us are ones that, by and large, probably with the exception of the budget process, are affected by timelines. But this is clearly one that the Supreme Court has given a timeline of 6 months, hence the decision of their court of when this law had to be struck down. And indeed, I would say by the decision as I interpret it, it would say that there has to be a workable system in place. It's not good enough just that you repeal the bad law, but you replace the bad law, and you explain how that is going to work now to on the same test for every worker, every injured worker with chronic pain in this province. And with that, kind of a side issue is, like, the board hasn't even attempted in any kind of public way to find out who is out there that may be affected by the October 3rd decision. That was one of the many phone calls I was making this weekend, where people saying, am I in or am I out? And I had to basically tell them, I don't know. But if you were perceived, if you were told under Section 10 that you weren't eligible, I would say I would call WCB and ask for my file to be reactivated. If you were ineligible because you were before the Bill 90, but after the charter came in place in the country, that you may be eligible, move forward. But there's no clear enunciation coming from the board that's telling us this is the people that we want. Or if you think, you often see an advertisement for a group that's, if you're involved with a class action suit, and this pretty well comes to that threshold. If you're involved with a class action suit, and so if you find that within this time period that you were injured or have chronic pain or been harmed by a decision of the board for these reasons, and within this time period, please call this number, and we will do what we can for you. There's many people out there, and that could really be appreciative of that it would go a long way to help them. But it goes back to the credibility of the board once again, Mr. Speaker, or the management of the board. By not doing that, injured workers in particular, are saying to me, well, see, there they go again. They're doing the same thing. What they're trying to do is, like, if we can get this thing in and passed before a lot of these people realize it, then they'll be through it again. So what they want is the board to be more proactive, to go out there and say, that this is where we feel that you may have been wronged, and we want you to come forward, and we want to be able to help you. Use their own words, and I think that would be a very good step forward if we're going to tell people that this board is going to move forward, that the management of WCB are going to move forward, if the strategic planning committee is going to move forward, then we need buy-in, and we need honest buy-in. Right now, I would tell you, as I stand here in my place today, Mr. Speaker, that those committees do not have the support of injured workers, and they do not have the support of organized labor for that mere fact, is that there's no transparency. There seems to be a real change of direction when they go into a meeting and they agree on something and it comes out the other end. The water isn't always as clear coming out that end of the pipe, Mr. Speaker. So we need a kind of a sea change at the board, if you will, that they're going to see that these people are truly partners before the injured workers and organized labor will buy into the process. I noticed with again with the minister's statement about funding some of the groups, and I think that's a laudable effort. It's an interesting thing, you know, when you see these injured workers groups out there, and you would hope that they wouldn't be necessary to act as advocates, because what we do is we have advocates out there in the form of the Workers' Advisors Program. But, you know, to that group, they are clearly they are clearly in a position to be overworked, and that's why they come to our groups. There's other factors that cause some problems with getting together with the Workers' Advisors Program, and not the least of which is when I talk, they are overworked, and what happens is that there's many times that they will be able to take somebody in and assess them, if you will, as they come in the door, Workers' Advisors Program. And for those who don't know, the Workers' Advisor Program is a system set up of basic lawyers and other legal advisors that will represent you at the WCB and onward from there to the WCAT, is Workplace or the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, that will represent you there. But the problem is that there's only 2 offices in the province, one in Halifax and one in Cape Breton, and you know, if an injured worker, you know, it's hard for them to access one in Yarmouth because it's not there, or any other intermediate areas, and so we have some real problems with accessibility, not only from the timeliness, but geographically. So that's a problem. So what happens sometimes is, from time to time, is you do have these injured workers groups springing up, and they've become the advocates in the community, whether it's the South Shore group, it's the Pictou County Workers Group, or the Halifax, Nova Scotia one, or indeed the one I'm the most familiar with, Mr. Speaker, is a lot of my good friends at the Injured Workers Group in Cape Breton, which they do. You know, these are people, by and large, have come into the system or have become workers' advocates because they're injured workers themselves, and that they know that how hard and how futile fights can be with the board from time to time if you do not have proper representation. So what happens is, you know, people, first of all, their first stop is usually at WAP or Workers' Advisor Program, but it's because they have such a huge caseload that they really don't have the ability to take on as many cases as they need. And what happens with injured workers, Mr. Speaker, is they end up having their hearing dates delayed and so on until the Workers' Advisor can fit them into their very, very busy calendar. And sometimes what they'll then do is go to these injured workers groups who work on an ad hoc basis and help these people, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask time, Mr. Speaker?
You have, see, you have 5 more minutes, 5.5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, I want to use then my time remaining, Mr. Speaker, just to tell yourself and the assembled here, Mr. Speaker, that this is a bill that it's not an offensive bill by its content. It's not a bill that says, if minus the Dorsey report and minus the federal court decision around chronic pain, this wouldn't be an offensive bill to deal with. It would be by and large considered a step forward. There's nothing really in this bill, with the exception of wanting to handle things by way of regulation. The bill itself is by and large a step forward. But the argument is that how much longer can we rely on the patience and the goodwill of workers who get injured in this province day in, day out to say, okay, we're going to get to you. Your day will come. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think injured workers are saying that their day came on October 3rd, 2003, when the federal government struck down the chronic pain legislation in this province. And they made a very bold statement. They made a bold statement to the people in this province that said, you've got to change them. Similar to what Dorsey said in his report. So we have to take that boldness right through. We cannot take these small steps and say, this is going to work, but bide your time. We will see changes to universal coverage. We will see changes to the deeming process. We'll see changes for the widows. We'll see changes around medical opinion and acceptance, Mr. Speaker. These are things that I believe that injured workers have waited too long for. It's a decade in the making, Mr. Speaker. It's a decade after, more than a decade after we found out of the horrendous problems at WCB. At times we're trying to fix the board setup to make it reflective of the stakeholders, to the idea of making the management team reflective of a modern workplace insurance company, Mr. Speaker. These are things that are moving forward. But the lost group in this are the injured women and men in this province, who are literally in the thousands out there who are undercompensated for their injuries, Mr. Speaker. We have to go out and reach out to those individuals and make sure it's done in a large way. I'm not asking, nor are injured workers, nor organized labor asking in this province to change the system to give the advantage to them. What they're quite simply asking is make the system fair. Make the system in balance. Make sure it's in sync. Make sure it's reflective of what we want and what employers need. We know very well that besides being the second lowest in benefits, we're the second highest in premiums, Mr. Speaker. I think those questions have to be looked at and they have to be answered in a fair and accurate way. Injured workers did not cause us to have such high premium rates, Mr. Speaker. We know that. Everyone in this House knows that. So what we got to do is come up with a system that radically changes what happens to workers when they get injured in this province. The Dorsey is the report that's been acknowledged by all sides, all sectors, as the way to go. But we cannot do it in little baby steps, Mr. Speaker. The government has to show real initiative and real integrity here and move forward in a large way, just as the federal court did in its October 3rd decision. I think government has to do that, Mr. Speaker. I would think by accepting amendments in a large way to this bill and really putting injured workers on the front burner instead of the back burner would go a long way with showing that. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great pleasure I rise to speak on Bill 20. It's an act that really had to be changed for a long time. It's unfortunate that a ruling of Supreme Court of Canada was necessary to have this act changed. I work with people every day with chronic pain, trying to get proper compensation for the pain that they go through and the suffering they go through. And unfortunately, the workers' compensation, as of to date, hasn't really adequately addressed those concerns. Just have to ask an injured person that has chronic pain that can't go to work, and what the financial implications are alone, never mind the suffering and pain they go through every day. You see someone that's worked at a profession, say a nurse or another individual or another occupation that makes a very good income, wants to work, has the capability of working with their educational background and all the things that go with it, but live with so much pain each day they can't get up and go to work. If they get up and go to work, it may last a couple hours, may be in bed for 2 or 3 days after that. We've heard some testimony regarding the insurance bill in that regard, and you've heard people that are on record indicating that they come in to provide testimony for that hearing, and that they'll be in bed for 2 or 3 days after that as a result of just that simple act of coming to Halifax, maybe from Dartmouth or some other area that's very close, and sitting there for a few hours and making a 10 or 15-minute presentation. That's a pretty sad statement to live with. The other thing that really upsets me is I was recently a presenter to the members of the Medical Society regarding chronic pain and pension activities. And the Workers' Compensation Board was there, one of their doctors that makes decisions on these cases, actually, and recommendations, as were Canada Pension. The doctor indicated during his presentation that a lot of people are lay-arounds, they don't want to work, they'd rather be on compensation than actually do anything. Now, that was a disgraceful thing to do, and when I made my presentation and referred to his comments, he got very upset, but he had to apologize afterwards. And I was very upset about that, as were many of the people there with chronic pain, and as were many of the medical professionals there that really see the results of chronic pain. It really has to work. The system has to work. It has to work fairly for everyone. I'm a former employer. I did pay workers' compensation. I had people injured that worked for me, unfortunately. Fortunately, none of them were very seriously injured or long-term injuries. But the whole process is slowly coming around. I can remember about 5 or 6 years ago when the government changed the process to paying your payments every month instead of the old system where you had to do a guesstimate what your employees were going to be for the year. If you guessed wrong, you paid a penalty. If you underguessed, you paid a penalty. If you went over on what you had to owe them. If you overestimated what your employment was going to be, you definitely didn't get anything in bonus from the Workers' Compensation Board. So it was rather one-sided for employers as well as employees. The safety issue and the training and education are a very important issue as well. I'm a bit concerned about this bill, a little bit more than a bit concerned. I'm very concerned about this bill and the fact that they're going to take the Occupational Health and Safety Organization, roll into the Workers' Compensation Board, which on the surface it looks very good. But unfortunately, when you really look at the costs, are the budgets going to go with that? Are the budgets going to go to the workers' compensation, or is that going to be just another downloading on industry and the people of Nova Scotia while the government uses that money somewhere else in their budget? And I would like maybe when the minister wraps up this comment, he can make some reference to that if he'd be kind enough to do that, because I'd like to hear his comments in that regard. But safety is a real issue, and making sure that people don't get injured in the first place. And if you look at all these issues and how the Compensation Board has worked in the past, it's been bad. You look at years ago when it was political interference, when people would actually put on compensation because somebody made a call to one of the board members and it happened. And I'm glad to see, or hopefully that has been completely eliminated and won't happen anymore. I'd hate to think if a new insurance program that the province is putting forward on auto insurance had the same kind of an impact. And it would be nice to see, finally, people compensated for the injuries they have. But it has to be done in a fair way as well. It's no good giving somebody compensation for pain and suffering if the amount calculated is $20 a week or something foolish like that. That doesn't do anybody any good that's lost their home, lost everything they've had, and simply can't live under the conditions that they're living under. And we see so many people like that. As I said earlier, people that are professionals, working in places that they make very good income, and indeed can have an excellent lifestyle. Why would somebody with that kind of lifestyle potential want to stay home and get no income at all and not really serve the thing that they work so hard to get in their profession. It doesn't make sense. So chronic pain is real, and it is real for people in the community that live with it every day. The other thing is, we have to see that the Supreme Court has made the decision. On October the 3rd, the decision came down, indicating by April the 3rd of 2004, we have to have a system in place that's forced this bill to come about. It's unfortunate it had to come that way, but at least it's there. And chronic pain must be treated like any other injury in industry or in business today. We have to see the opportunity for people that are really injured or really hurt, that they can live a lifestyle that's reasonable. It doesn't mean that what people want to travel all the time or do anything else, because most of the people in chronic pain simply can't do that. They want to just know that they're being fairly compensated for the pain and suffering that they've had in the past. The